Israel, as it exists, has been to replace the Palestinians. It's made clear by Netanyahu and his government of criminals, this most extreme form. They've put it out there, and of course the West go along with the objective. It's clearly to displace the Palestinians, to extinguish them if necessary. The end game is to seize Gaza, to end the Palestinian presence in the West Bank, to wipe the Palestinians off the map, to get them out of their ancestral homeland. That's the dreadful history of Zionism. That's the end game. Knew the Palestinian struggle for many, many decades, had come to the conclusion that the Palestinians were worse off than even the people of South Africa. We could note that the struggle of the Palestinians was even more difficult. Everything here is flattened. It's incomparable, and then they understood what I was saying. The absolute viciousness of Zionism is to exclude that these people do not belong here. We will get rid of them. That there is a greater seriousness in terms of the prosecution of these criminal elements who are joining the Israeli armed forces and are participating in its genocide against the Palestinian people. In the end, we will win.
Apartheid was internationally condemned as a crime against humanity. Do you believe that Israel's actions against Palestinians, including mass civilian killings, in addition to spreading havoc in the Middle East and many countries in the Middle East, warrant the same classification and therefore the same sanctions against Israel?
Absolutely. As severe as possible. Sanctions, mandatory sanctions, sanctions imposed through the United Nations made a huge difference. It helped to change the situation. It helped to bring down apartheid. It reinforced the struggle, the resistance of the people of South Africa, the indigenous people. And it helped to mobilize the world in terms of boycott, divestment, sanctions. The sanctions through the UN of the governments of the world. The divestment in terms of businesses, companies, churches, trade unions who had invested in various ways, not even directly, but in terms of the whole investment chain, and the boycott of products by civil society. These are absolutely vital. And you see, when you talk about the havoc, the danger to the region, in fact to international peace, to world peace, is so similar in relation to apartheid South Africa, who was spreading havoc throughout the region. You'll recall its invasion of the neighboring states, full-scale invasion into Angola, which was stopped when Cuban internationalist forces reinforced the Angolan people's military and drove South Africa out, which led to freedom for Namibia and then South Africa, by the way. The way in which apartheid South Africa had engaged in supporting counter-revolutionary forces in both Angola and in Mozambique. The attacks of South Africa in Lesotho, in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, places. And we see this with Israel. The havoc there, the latest invasion, this criminal invasion of Lebanon, the bombing of Beirut, the bombing of many places in Lebanon, the attacks on Syria, and they've been attacking Syria in one way or another for so long. Any attack on Lebanon willy-nilly includes Syria. They're so much part
Yes.
As we know of history and geography, and of course support of the Syrians, along with the way in which the resistance gets support from the Yemenis, from Ansarallah, so-called Houthi groups there. So the havoc that is spreading can only be stopped when the military machine of Israel is deprived of the weaponry, of the bombs supplied by the United States, the munitions from Germany, from the UK and other countries. This enables the crime of genocide, and the only way that this can be stopped is through the United Nations. The United Nations must be reinforced. The way the US and Israel treats the United Nations in such a derogatory way, it's absolutely a crime against humanity. Just that rejection of international law, of international human rights law, of the role of the United Nations, of the violation of all the resolutions. So it's a world issue in the same way that apartheid in South Africa became a world issue. And this is what has to be done. And this is in support of the rights of all the people of Western Asia, of what's called the Middle East, including Africa.
Do you see any chances of the United Nations enforcing or slamming real sanctions against Israel in light of the fact that Israel has always maintained and enjoyed that impunity by the international actors like the United States?
Of course, it's a tough
and the Europeans.
It's a tough nut to crack, but it doesn't mean that it can't be cracked. We have seen, since the period of the UN in its heyday, the decolonization process following the Second World War, and particularly in the 60s and so on, in terms of African independence and the support for armed resistance throughout Africa and elsewhere against colonial regimes. We've seen it's got to a point where the United States particularly, and of course its cohorts, which are basically the former Western colonial powers who disgracefully go along with the USA in the way in which the Palestinians are just derided and their rights are hypocritically downgraded. You know, at the same time, we've seen how these countries rally to the support of Ukraine, but not to Palestinians fighting a just war. So the United Nations is going through an inordinate crisis, and at the same time, the majority of countries overwhelmingly support the right of Palestine in all respects, and would support sanctions, which is why the US, and again I use the word, its cohorts, try to push the United Nations aside and stand against its resolutions, and we see the card that the US plays so often just alone with Israel at the Security Council. So we've seen a virtual, a powerful move from the rest of the world to change the basis of the way the UN works and changes at the Security Council against the use of the veto system, which saves Israel over and over. And that's a challenge that humanity is facing, and humanity in its numbers will win, because we are the many, they are the few.
Mr. Ronnie, if you could travel back in time and were given a choice of fighting the apartheid regime in South Africa or the one in Israel, which one would you choose?
It's not a question of one or the other. I'm a South African. Yes, I'm of Jewish descent. but not a Zionist, which means that South Africa is my country. I don't go along with the prescription of Zionism, that anti-Semitism is intrinsic to humanity, that the way to deal with any forms of racism is by joining, as I did, with a struggle for democracy in South Africa to free South Africa. And this is what good Jews, anti-Zionist Jews, do everywhere in the world. They're not interested in going to a colonial settlement under Zionism in a land seized from indigenous people. They see the way of dealing with racism and prejudice and segregation and all those ills by building and fighting for democracy where they live. So the struggle that I've been involved in for freedom and the development of democracy in South Africa, equality of people, justice for all, one country, a unitary state, a democratic state, secular state, non-racist, equal in every sense, is linked to a support for a Palestinian struggle. So it's a solidarity factor, which means that my life and my energy, together with the people of South Africa, Jewish and all different backgrounds, goes into a struggle now to help the Palestinians to be free. So it's this interrelated connection of struggles. It's not one or the other. I would never go back and simply say I've got a choice whether I'm a South African and whether I just fight here for freedom here, or would have I rather gone back through my line of immigration of my grandparents to South Africa. You know, I once, if I can give you an anecdote, I once was talking in a visit to Palestine, and I met left-wing Jews who came to meet me in East Jerusalem, and they said, when we were talking about our ancestry, which, as you know, in many cases, so many Jews came out of the former Russian Empire, Lithuania, Latvia, Russia itself, Odessa, and so on. And we found that we had a similar background. And they said, oh, can you imagine if your ancestors had settled in Palestine like ours had, we would be in this together here. Yeah. Well, I laughed at that, and that's destiny. I can't say that in going back, maybe I would have ended up in a specific way. If I can say, you know, God thanks that I never was in a situation, even as a left-wing Jew, of replacing Palestinian people from the indigenous heritage. So I'm so thankful that my grandparents decided to emigrate from Lithuania and Latvia to come and settle in South Africa. And I want to say to you that from my parents, who weren't Zionists, they weren't political, they were hard-working people, but what I learned from them was to respect everybody. And my mother particularly said that what's intrinsic in the Judaic religion is respect others as you wish them to respect you. That aspect has actually motivated me, opened my eyes, my consciousness, and brought me to a point in time when I was basically about 20, when I rebelled against apartheid South Africa, and I joined the ANC, the Communist Party, the Liberation Movement, and very quickly became an internationalist and a supporter of the absolute rights of the Palestinian people, amongst others.
Good. Let me read this out. On July 23, 1986, at a hearing at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joe Biden blasted his government for its inaction regarding what he described as the repugnant and disgusting white apartheid regime of South Africa. In his speech, he described his government as lacking the moral backbone, and that the favorites of the US must be the black South Africans. who are being repressed.
Favorites in South Africa are the people who are being repressed by that ugly white regime. We have favorites. Our loyalty is not to South Africa, it's to South Africans. And the South Africans are majority black.
38 years later, the same Joe Biden stands as the US president squarely behind Israel's genocide against the Palestinians and the Lebanese.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
The question is, which Joe Biden do you believe?
Well, that Joe Biden, that particular Joe Biden back in 1986, was it?
Yes.
Was actually speaking to the gallery. An absolute opportunist, a hypocrite, as we see today.
Even when he spoke that way back in
Even then,
1986?
because what I want to do is say that the man, just a few years back, lied through his teeth. And he said when he was in South Africa on a visit, just before he made that statement, that he had been arrested because of his anti-apartheid activities in South Africa. He was called out on that. We examined the books, the history, anything relating to that, and it was shown that that arrest had never taken place in South Africa. He was making this up to boost himself for his own opportunistic career. His reasons were reasons which were not based on principle. And we've seen through his career what this man has become. He's an absolute disgrace to humanity. And he is a man, together with Blinken and his whole grouping, his elitism that rule in the United States, is responsible for the plight of the Palestinian people, where they've allowed over the years and even as we speak in the genocide to provide Israel with the munitions of death, with the monies that they require, etc. So I have utter contempt for the man, and he is no good for the American people, as he's no good for humanity.
So you didn't believe him when he spoke like that at the Senate?
Well,
back in 1986.
He's doing this in an opportunistic manner, and he's an utter hypocrite. So one doesn't pat him on the back, and we don't need the support of a man like that who was actually lying about what he had done in South Africa when he came on a visit.
South Africa eventually achieved a negotiated transition to democracy. Given the severity of Israel's actions, do you believe a similar approach is possible for Palestine?
Well, you see, one's got to unpack that. In relation to the context in South Africa, we were struggling for a unitary democratic state, not a negotiated settlement with a colonial ruling power that was going to maintain its political control of the country. It had to accept that there would be a one-state democratic solution in which everybody would be equal. And if we now look at what's happening in Palestine and the context of the confrontation playing there, one can't simply say that this can happen in Palestine. It would require, on the side of the Jewish population of Palestine, and I'm talking about historic Palestine, not just the entity of the Zionist Israel, but of the whole of historic Palestine, we would have to get to a point where the representatives of that Jewish community had seen the sense which at least had happened, although it was gradual, and they had to be forced here in South Africa to at least see the reality that all the people had to accept that there would be one country, one state, and equality for all.
So based on this, do you still believe, like many people, keep saying, do you believe in the two-state solution, or one state from the river to the sea for all its citizens, regardless of being Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims?
The latter definition that you've provided, that's, if we're talking about the example of resolving a issue such as we had in South Africa, where people in the world, except those who were supporting us in international solidarity, but where generally the view was it could never happen, that apartheid could not be removed, that the whites would never give up their sole control, their exclusive control of the country. They would have to give that up. That's the only road to a solution, the only road to peace and security for all. It's the only way in which they would be following the South African example. You see, the Zionists, now that Mandela is no longer alive, they tried to make out that Mandela was simply prepared to accept a negotiation without conditions. The conditions we had were very clear, very principled, from the release of all political prisoners to the question of negotiating a solution on the basis of recognizing the rights of all the people of the country. And if something of that nature occurred in Palestine, then the Jews there would have to accept that equality. Those who wouldn't feel they were up to it would have to go, and a lot of them are leaving. But it has to go through such a process of facing a reality and undoing the historic wrongs and the injustice that have been enforced by sheer violence on the Palestinian people.
As a Minister of Intelligence, were you involved in one way or another with supporting the Palestinian resistance movement, including Hamas, and if so, in which way?
Well, there are two periods, if you identify Hamas. So there's the period of Arafat and the PLO, up until the time of Oslo, let's say, and then Hamas and the Islamic Jihad and others become prominent, and not only the PLO of Fatah, who were the allies of the ANC. And of course, as we know, Mandela himself was very close, as Oliver Tambo, the leader of the ANC, while Mandela was in prison, was very close to Arafat, as we all were to the PLO and the Palestinian resistance. Through the period of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we were very close indeed, as all the liberation movements were. We can bring in and talk about Frelimo and the MPLA and the liberation groups from Algeria to Guinea-Bissau, the Cubans, all over the world, the Vietnamese, the people of Namibia, of Zimbabwe. And it was this period of tremendous advance. Colonialism was falling everywhere, and the liberation movements were going from strength to strength. We can remember a time when Arafat was lionized the United Nations and spoke there about the prospects for the future, and he wasn't regarded as a terrorist, and the resistance was supported to a tremendous degree. It's at Oslo that situation changes. So we've got to concern how the ANC movement and others related pre-Oslo to the Palestinian struggle and post. I've referred to the enormous solidarity and alliance in that period, pre-Oslo, when the negotiations take place. And it's post-Oslo that Hamas and other resistance groups come to the fore. So we didn't know them pre that period. It's post that we get to know them, but it's also a time when Oslo, as we now see, was an absolute trap in which the Palestinians were pressurized to accept the two-state situation, which I would say has been partly responsible to the problems which they've encountered, and the deaths that have resulted, including clearly the murder over time through poisoning of Arafat. I think that's become quite clear. So if you want me to just quickly deal with that period, let me say that ourselves here in South Africa, under Mandela's government, we were deluded into thinking this was a path that could resolve the problem. And history has shown that that was impossible, that at the time from Sharon to Netanyahu and others were determined to prevent that happening, that even from the point of view of Rabin and his Labour Party, they weren't out to deliver a full dispensation of equality or freedom to the Palestinians, even in a separate state, because it was so hemmed in that it was clearly on the path to becoming a fragmented, multi-Bantustan type state. It's in that period that Hamas and other resistance groups emerge and become the major heart of resistance, which is why they become so popular. So it's in that period that we become closer to understanding what Palestinian resistance had become. And I can say, and it's been well known, that I had meetings as a minister now with Hamas, particularly as an intelligence minister, both in Damascus and even visiting Gaza when I met with the late Ismail Haniyeh, who's been murdered recently, assassinated by an act of terror in Iran, as we know, and Khaled Mashal and other resistance organizations in Damascus. I would say that was something of a breakthrough, that as an intelligence minister I began to develop an understanding and links with such groups. Not that our country was now supporting simply those groups as against Fatah, although the critique of Fatah has grown as that of the other resistance groups has risen as they showed their mettle of standing up against Israel to the extent that they have over time. So there are those two periods, and there's been a stronger growth in such interaction, and we've seen this with Hamas delegations coming to South Africa, for example, with our former foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, meeting them as well. The links with Iran, the links with Syria have grown and become stronger. I had visited Lebanon many times as well, and I've been extremely impressed. So I would say, not only speaking for myself, I've seen this with my colleagues from the time I'm in government, and post that, and increasingly so, that people have in South Africa, and people at government level, people at the level of the ANC leadership, its rank and file particularly, and those of the alliance of ANC and Communist Party, the rank and file are so solidly in support of resistance to Zionist Israel and the USA, which includes, in fact, the support for Russia in its existential position vis-a-vis NATO and the Ukraine. And we see that similarity. But what I would say, coming to the Middle East, and I traveled there extensively, in relation to the humanity, in relation to the understanding of the rules of warfare and the United Nations Geneva Convention, in terms of the wellspring out of Islam and going back to the 7th century, and the Prophet Muhammad, well, the statesman, the general, the leader of the emergent Islamic world, an interest into how he perceived warfare. And anybody who reads the statements made about how you treat your enemy, how you don't annihilate women and children and the wounded and the sanctity of places of religion and so on, one sees such an incredible difference between the war code of Israel and its defense force. And by the way, we've seen this with the forces of imperialism, from the USA to the French to the Germans and the Nazis, of course, but to the British and all these empires, and how they behaved in colonial times, which from my point of view is an explanation of why they don't see anything wrong with the way Israel, Zionist Israel, deals with its opponents, the Palestinian people and the people of the whole region, who they have created havoc and war with over the time since the inception of the State of Israel.